The alien ship appeared over the heliopause like a winter storm rolling in from a black ocean. It did not blink or twinkle as human satellites did. It absorbed the starshine and returned only a hard edge, a geometry too confident for nature. Along its flanks, thousands of needle-thin spires pulsed in ritual cadence, and at the prow hung a disk engraved with changing shapes, a language that seemed to reweave itself with every breath humans took on Earth, as if grammar could be a weapon. Prefect Halov Saret of the Lattice Prefecture stood on a bridge that was half cathedral, half armory. For 3 millennia, the Lattice had stitched worlds to its will with a single ceremony: arrive, broadcast, collect, surrender. He had performed the rite more times than he recalled. In his mind, species came in 2 types, those who learned quickly and those who died learning. He expected humans to be the second sort, exuberant, fractious, briefly troublesome. His opening transmission throbbed across radio and neutrino, every syllable stepping in time with that living disk at the prow. Inhabitants of the water-blue world, your system has been classified non-sovereign. The Lattice offers custodial integration. Accept and prosper, resist and become memory. You have 72 standard hours. On Earth, the transmission arrived in a storm of languages already cross-mapped by the Lattice's linguists. They did not know they were whispering to a planet that had been practicing its answer for half a century. In Geneva, in a room that had once hosted law scholars and climate agreements, Admiral Elena Park listened with hands folded. The room had been renamed the Commonwealth Chamber when the United Terran Commonwealth formed, but the long table still bore dents from years when diplomats thumped it to emphasize urgency. The dents were a kind of fossil, proof that words had once saved lives. President Ashap Patel's voice was steady. We knew this day would arrive. We chose the nature of our answer a long time ago. Admiral, Park tapped the table once, a quiet percussion. Statement of non-submission is ready. The transmission they sent back was brief enough to memorize. We acknowledge your message. Earth is not non-sovereign. We decline custodial integration. You will depart this system within 24 hours. There was no roar, no bravado, no video montage of missiles or flags, only words. The Lattice's observers parsed every clause and flagged no uncertainty. On Halov's bridge, the ritual rhythm faltered for the first time in a millennium. Perhaps they mistranslated, his adjutant offered. They didn't, Halov said, but they will. He composed a second broadcast, more intimate, the way a teacher speaks to a child whose hand hovers over a stove. He listed implications, fleets, planets darkened into compliance, the long arithmetic of empires. He asked them to be sensible. The reply from Earth arrived faster. It included an artifact that had never before accompanied rebellion. Laughter. Not mocking, not hysterical. A low, tired chuckle, as if someone had been holding a joke for 50 years and finally chose to release it. While the Lattice argued over tone, the solar system shifted. Old comets that had slept in Kuiper dark woke and bled cold flame. A coin-sized drone under an Antarctic sky turned its dish a fraction of a degree and heard a silence it had been taught to expect. The silence of doors locking. A tug embedded in the Vesta mines reversed its counterweights and folded a tunnel like paper. Behind Luna's bulk, shadows that were not shadows peeled themselves from scaffolds. They were ships, angles upon angles, hulls matte enough to drink light. People on Earth slept and woke and went to work. They quarreled about breakfast and politics. They drove to fields, classrooms, hospitals. If fear lived in them, it lived beside other things. A promise whispered in barracks and labs that if the sky ever darkened, they would not repeat their worst histories. Humanity had studied the 20th century not as a museum, but as a manual, what to do, what never to do again. In the Commonwealth Chamber, Park watched status icons brighten across a table-sized map of the system. Aegis arrays coming online in the Uit, Heimdall nets spooling up around gas giant wells, shipyard doors retracting on Luna's far side. Operation Hearthfire, once a code name scrawled in a basement, now breathed. Will you give a speech? asked Minister Okoy. Later, President Patel said, "Speeches are for the living, and my job is to keep people alive." Park permitted herself a small smile. "It's time," she said, "to do what we trained for." Her staff nodded some too quickly. The fear was there, good, honest, galvanizing. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is a decision made with fear at the table. Park remembered what her grandfather had told her as a girl, pointing at an old photo of a bridge and a river. Protesters had crossed that bridge in their day, beaten but not broken. "We didn't defeat hate with greater hate," he'd said. "We defeated it with the stubbornness of people who refused to stop walking." "Open the Interfleet Channel," Park ordered. Across the system, ships listened. In Ceres dry docks, welders paused with masks up. In a habitat ring over Mars, someone muted a children's show. In a submarine city under Europa ice, the lights dimmed to battle blue. "This is Admiral Elena Park of the United Terran Commonwealth," she said. "You have trained for a war you hoped would never arrive. You will do your work with skill and restraint. You will remember that every enemy has a family and that we fight to protect ours without destroying theirs. The lattice is not a god. It is a habit, and habits can be broken." Halov heard her through a filter array that turned human vowels into crystalline bursts. The confidence of it annoyed him less than the serenity. He preferred his primitives panicked. He gestured, and the prow disk bloomed with new glyphs. Around the flagship, the lattice's sentry flotilla adjusted to a formation designed to awe and punish. "Prepare the pacification fleet," he said. "If they insist on learning, we will teach." But teaching, as Halov would soon learn, is a two-way arrangement. Out beyond Neptune's blue rim, human ships slid into geometries drawn by people who had studied both history and the night sky. Traps were not the point. Traps were merely the punctuation at the end of a sentence Earth had been writing for half a century. We are not easy prey. The 24 hours began to fall away like ash from a torch. The galaxy drifted on, barely noticing that a story it had told itself for 3,000 years was about to be corrected. The project's true name had never made it into any public ledger. Operation Hearthfire sounded like a motto for a winter charity drive, and that was the point. You could hide a factory behind a barn if you painted it the color of kindness. Inside Hearthfire lay a design philosophy that could have been an ethics syllabus. Win quickly to spare lives, win cleanly to spare souls, win visibly to end the war before it metastasized into hatred. Its preface had been written 5 decades before by a committee of teachers, soldiers, and a poet who refused to separate the words victory and home. The first line sat above every engineering deck where components were tested to the edge of metals. "We prepare so that our children never have to." The second line offended a few and inspired the rest. "We will be dangerous without becoming monstrous." The lattice never imagined its targets might prepare the way scholars do, by arguing over first principles until dawn, and then building with those principles welded into the frame. Humanity's shipyards were not just factories. They were monasteries of purpose. On the far side of Luna, whole canyons had been hollowed and pressurized and filled with cranes that moved like patient birds. In the rain shadow of Olympus Mons, lathe halls hummed, their output whisked away in cargo pods that appeared on no officially announced freight schedule. In the iron-rich bones of Vesta, children had grown up hearing the bass heartbeat of ore processors under their beds and assuming it was thunderstorms in space. Admiral Park toured the Luna line one last time before battle. The largest slips were empty now, their former occupants already draped in star cold. She stopped beside a hull segment the color of night with the gloss sanded off. Students from the Caltech Kashiwa Cooperative stood in a cluster, nervously proud. "Your composite layered like this gives us 10 extra seconds under spall," Park said, running a glove along the grit. 10 seconds is the difference between a letter home and a funeral. A girl with grease on her cheek swallowed hard. "We read about Midway, Admiral," she blurted. "How fortune can swing on minutes. We designed for mercy's sake 2 modular cooling so weapons can stand down faster." Park smiled. You're exactly why this matters. We don't just build because we're clever. We build because we're responsible. Hearthfire's intelligence arm, Minerva, had been listening to the galaxy as if to a murmuring neighbor through thin walls. Not with romantic spies and leather folders, but with radio telescopes and patient math. Years earlier, Minerva noticed star systems where power spectra rose and then fell into neat lines, industrial silence enforced by someone's will. It learned the cadence of lattice rituals by watching the way planetary night sides brightened just before conquests and darkened after. It taught itself the shapes of defeat. Then it taught Earth the shapes of resistance. Interdictor nets ready, reported Commander Owino now, standing beneath the glowing spiral of the solar system in operations. We can curtain their exits along 4 fracture planes. Our models predict a 93% reduction in successful hyperspace transition if they attempt a jump under net. EW suites? Park asked. Lysander, Orpheus, Aurora, all green. We can sing them to sleep, or at least make them blink. President Patel appeared on the main wall with the quiet authority of a family doctor in a crisis. Our doctrine remains, she said, voice even. Last resort, proportionality, discrimination, right intention. She had been a human rights lawyer before politics, and she refused to let war trample the vocabulary that separates us from the abyss. We neutralize capacity to harm while preserving capacity to learn. Madam President, Park replied, we'll fight like we studied. She meant history as much as physics. The deck around her carried names embedded under the resin, Thermopylae not as a suicide note, but as a caution about hubris, Warsaw as a prayer for courage, the Selma Bridge as an engineering diagram for how to march when the road hurts. War colleges had changed, too. War games still taught flanking and logistics, but they added classes on reconciliation, trauma, and the architecture of trust after guns cool. Cadets wrote essays evaluating the Marshall Plan beside treatises on orbital gunnery. Every missile had a lawyer assigned. Every lawyer toured a warship until gravity sickness taught humility. In the colder reaches, Neptune wore its crown of thin rings. Beyond them, a faint web came to life, lightless to eyes, bright to instruments. Heimdall nodes mapped space stress like weather vanes. Basalt interdictors tested their throats. Hard science harnessed to a single humane sentence. You can't run while you're hurting people. The lattice sentry wing at the edge of the system reported the net's first whisper as if it were a stray gravitational ripple. Halev's adjutant suggested recalibrating. No, Halev said. They're laying snares. Good. It means they know their prey. But Park's staff had trained themselves to think like water and surgeons, not hunters. We don't need them to call us predators, Owino murmured as if answering a thought she disliked. We need them to call us neighbors when this ends. Neighbors lock doors when someone rattles the handle, Park replied, and they call the authorities. Today we are the authority for our own house. The 24 hours bled to 6, then 3. On Earth the sky was ordinary blue. In Nairobi an auntie scolded a boy for stealing mango slices. In Calgary a mechanic cursed a stubborn bolt. In Manila, traffic failed and succeeded to move. The world's mundane heart kept beating, and Hearthfire engineering teams listened to it as if timing a patient's pulse. In that steadiness lay the lesson Park wanted her officers to internalize. You are not defending an abstraction. You are defending breakfasts and jokes, teenagers texting in slang older folks pretend to dislike, lectures about seatbelts, late buses, the crinkle of bagged bread, dog hair on black pants. Nations had gone to war in the past for gods and glory. Earth would go now for the simple right to raise children under a sky not licensed by a foreign bureaucracy. Status? Park asked as the final hour began. All primary battle groups in position, Owino said. Task Force Sable at Neptune Gate, Task Force Laurel at the Inner Anchor, Task Force Cannon holding the Jovian Well, Lysander and Orpheus reading clean. Then we begin, Park said. Broadcast our last word before first contact. Depart while you can do so with dignity. Halev watched the sentence crawl across 1,000 instruments. Dignity, a primitive mouth shaping a patrician word. He almost admired it. Then he did what the lattice had always done. He called for a fleet. They came not as pilgrims, but as an answer. 20 scar-bright cruisers escorted by cutters like knives in a chef's block, their hulls tattooed with doctrine. Between them moved carrier shapes that wore ceremonial light the way warlords wear jewels. The lattice expected to teach by spectacle. Spectacle met a different teacher. Task Force Sable arrived in a geometry rehearsed until muscles remembered what the mind doubted. Battleships Mercy and Resolute slid into positions offset by milliseconds, the kind of timing that seems superhuman until you realize humans built jazz before they built guns. Frigates borrowed gravity from Neptune's bulk like thieves with a key. Destroyers ran lines of software through the void, tuning it as if it were a stringed instrument the size of a moon. Lattice cutters volleyed first, confident in the way the rich are confident about doors opening. Their energy spears should have cored anything human. They met a wall that wasn't a wall, an interference sheath called Aurora that did not block so much as mislead, relabeling voltage as fatigue, convincing sensors to flinch rather than fire. Lysander is in, EW Chief Tanaka said. 3 of theirs are blinking. On Park's board, 3 lattice icons grayed, not destroyed but lost in the middle of their own thoughts, like professors who forget their car keys while inventing a theorem. Sable's destroyers surged past, their rail lances murmuring. The shots weren't the fireworks ancient movies promised. They were whispers that made armor decide to be dust. The first cruiser's skin peeled as if it had sunburn, then lifted away in a shrug of plates that fluttered into darkness. Target drive throats, not cores, Park reminded her gunners. We're here to halt, not annihilate. They obeyed. War is obedience and creativity braided together to form responsibility. Human gunnery officers picked out the parts of lattice ships that equaled momentum and breadth, engine bells, coolant vanes, the optical nerves of targeting arrays. The lattice design language had been boastful for centuries. It had never needed to hide its organs. Now it learned humility in real time. A carrier unscrolled its fighter wing, dazzling like a school of metal fish. They flew with bold arrogance, carving knife marks into the black. Humanity's pilots answered with maneuvers that would have made pre-war instructors curse, and then applaud. Thrust vectors arced around mathematics that looked like calligraphy. Where the lattice tried to envelop, humans dissolved into smaller entities and then resolved into larger ones, moving the way a flock turns without a leader and confuses the hawk. Tanaka's voice came warm with restrained glee. Orpheus reports we've sung away their self-destruct protocols on 2 units. Boarding? Park asked. Marines deployed, Oino answered. They're wearing the white panels. The white panels meant cameras and med kits were as accessible as rifles. Every boarding squad had trained longer in first aid than in close quarters shooting, and their body cams streamed not to public feeds hungry for blood, but to a live ethics cell with authority to abort engagements if the tide of violence rose too much. Laws of war weren't bullet points on a website. They were living orders with the weight of rank. A lattice cruiser tried to ram. Mercy yawed and took the hit on the angular shoulder she was built to present to fools. She rode the impact like a boxer turning his jaw at the last instant, then reached out with harpoon lines that were not weapons but doors. Once latched, those doors blew and Marines in white-paneled armor entered a corridor lit hellish red. The first lattice sailor they met was young enough to be anyone's child. Her crest spines flattened, a species equivalent of raised hands. The Marine lowered his muzzle reflexively. The camera watched. The ethics cell watched. Park's jaw tightened. Keep moving, she said softly. Secure the drives, secure the sickbay. On their bridges, lattice captains began to realize they had been cataloged like libraries. Human fire wasn't random. It crossed schematics with sociology. It struck where habit had bred laziness and ritual covered blind spots. Halev's doctrine had taught his officers to despise the unexpected. Earth's doctrine taught its officers to expect the unexpected and name it neighbor. Neptune's faint rings glowed in the frost of vented coolant, tracing arcs like chalk on blackboard. In those arcs lay lessons cadets would study for generations. How to refuse the tempting target that wastes ammunition. How to spare the stricken enemy not because mercy is cost-free, but because mercy accrues interest in futures you cannot yet price. Within 40 minutes, Task Force Sable had ripped the Vanguard's ability to leave or to fight well. Park ordered a pause, not to posture. To choose, the easy order would have been finishing fire. The hard order was to speak. "Transmit," she said. Her face appeared on lattice bridges, now strobing with alarms. "Prefecture Vanguard, you are disabled across a majority of your platforms. Medical assistance is en route. Self-destruct has been interdicted. Stand down. You will be treated in accordance with our law, which holds your dignity intact even if your guns are not." Some lattice officers mistook the tone for weakness and snarled to continue. Others, younger, listened and felt something crack in the shell they'd been raised inside. A small voice in a large system said, "They sound like teachers, not conquerors." Halev clenched a fist behind his back where no one could see. Pride is a useful tool until it is the last tool you have. "Signal the Armada," he told his adjutant. "Everything." In operations, Owino looked up from a fresh sheet of telemetry. "Admiral," she said, throat dry. "Minerva reads multiple hyperfronts opening near the heliopause. 200 signatures, maybe more." Park nodded as if the outcome had always included this chapter. "We planned for the tutorial," she said. "Here comes the comprehensive exam. Transition to Part 4. The lattice arrives en masse, and Earth must prove that restraint can dance with resolve under the worst pressure." When the Armada spilled from hyper like a waterfall breaking free of a cliff, some of Sable's youngest officers forgot to breathe. The lattice had turned intimidation into architecture. Ships came in nested formations like a cathedral inside a cathedral, every line a sermon about inevitability. At the center floated the crownship axial doctrine, a mountain of reflective armor and liturgy projectors meant to tell a story to pray. This is how the universe is shaped, and your outline does not matter. Hearthfire's maps drew a different story. Basalt interdictors hummed along the plains where space preferred to split. Heimdall nets read stress like violinists reading air. Task Force Laurel lit their drives on the inner lanes. Task Force Cannon climbed the Jovian gravity well. Sable widened its lines so the Armada would think there was a gap, then presented that gap like a maitre d' presenting a chair, polite, inviting, fatal. The lattice fired a world's worth of energy. Human ships did not meet it head-on so much as redirect the conversation. Aurora turned spears into questions. When questions met silence, gunnery replied with nouns. Drive throat, radiator spine, targeting eye. Rail lances sketched lines across space that later historians would trace and argue about in classrooms, the way previous generations argued troop movements at Thermopylae or Midway. The point was not to repeat heroics. The point was to avoid needing heroics at all. "Crownship is pivoting," Tanaka reported. "They're trying to execute a sanctuary collapse." "Interdict the corridor," Park said. "But do not fire on the sanctuary hull. They may be carrying non-combatants." "Admiral," Owino warned, "we can end them if we commit fully." "We can end more than them if we teach the wrong lesson," Park replied quietly. "Winning badly writes bad futures." It wasn't softness, it was arithmetic with longer terms. The lattice believed history's function was to glorify the center. Earth taught its cadets that history's function is to warn and to widen circles of care. The right win is not the one with the most trophies, it's the one that makes fewer wars necessary. "Open a channel to axial doctrine," Park ordered. The screen filled with a hall of glass and gold. Halev stood at its heart, furious and somehow smaller under the weight of his own ritual. "You presume to lecture us while stealing breath from our ships," he hissed. "We invite you to stop needing to breathe through other people's lungs," Park said. Withdraw, take your wounded. Return for diplomacy with your weapons cold. If you continue, you will not leave. Interdiction is netted. Ammunition is sufficient. Our patience is finite but friendly. Behind Park, Earth's bridges were a choreography of discipline. Officers called shots without savor. Marines reported prisoners without glee. Medics prepared triage not just for their own. Lawyers in crisp white collars watched battlefield feeds and typed clarifications to standing orders when adrenaline threatened to degrade judgment. The war machine was not just gears and steel, it was grammar and conscience, deliberately heavy. Praetor Verun, Halov called, summoning his armada commander. Break them. Verun tried. He was good at drawing lines by which lesser enemies stumbled. Humanity simply refused to be lesser. Laurel slid under a carrier wall and raised it by cutting not the wall but its hinges. Canon used Ganymede's bone to slingshot into a rear quadrant and wrote a sentence across the Armada's logistics train. Without fuel, zeal is theater. Sable finished each thought with just enough emphasis. In music, that is called taste. In war, it is called Mercy's strategy. On the fourth hour, Halov watched icons vanish too quickly to name them. He recognized the ugly old friend that had spared him throughout his career. Fear. Not fear of dying, which is personal, but fear of being wrong in public, which is political. He could still save face if he framed retreat as tactical repositioning. The Lattice culture prized narratives that defended dignity at the expense of truth. Halov had to choose which dignity he served, the Empire's story or the lives in his care. Stand down, he said to Verun, voice rough. Signal surrender to the enemy. On human screens, the Armada dimmed, weapons vented, drives fell to idle. Park let out a breath she hadn't admitted to holding. All units, she transmitted, cease fire, begin retrieval of survivors, maintain security. Remember, the enemy's worst act does not permit our worst act. Halov appeared again, stripped of the palace light. Without the liturgy projectors, he looked like a man with dust on his shoes. You have won a battle, he said, tasting the words like unfamiliar fruit. We have won an argument about how we'll live, Park answered. The battle is only evidence. Medics crossed the killing fields in ships that wore both symbols, a red cross for a tradition older than spaceflight and a new emblem, a broken chain mended into a ring. Lattice wounded flinched and then stilled as human hands did the boring miracles of trauma medicine. In the quiet that follows noise, truth can be heard without shouting. Some of Halov's officers wept behind their crests and did not know why. It was grief, and it was relief, and it was the first crack in a wall they had believed load-bearing. In the Commonwealth chamber, President Patel met Halov's gaze over encrypted channel. Prefect, she said, we can keep bleeding one another until both our civilizations limp for a century, or we can engage in a different curriculum. We will not be integrated. We will not integrate you, but we will speak. We will trade prisoners. We will codify borders and rules. And we will carry our laws forward into any talks because a law only matters when it constrains power. You lecture as if the galaxy were a classroom, Halov snapped, but softer now. The galaxy is a classroom, Patel said. We all inherit the homework of our ancestors. Ours includes the duty not to repeat our worst tests. Halov went silent. Behind him, Verun watched with a soldier's practical eye. He would write reports that emphasized logistics and surprise. Younger officers would read Park's words on pirate feeds and ask dangerous questions at Lattice academies. On Luna, Admiral Park walked the length of a recovery ward where Lattice and human lay separated only by curtains. A young Marine sat on a stool, lacing his fingers as if in prayer. First time, he told Park without being asked. Me too once, she said. You did your job. Feels like I did too much of it, he muttered. It should feel that way, Park said gently. If it ever feels easy, you've lost something we can't replace. He nodded, eyes wet, relieved that doubt was permitted. Education doesn't end when the firing does. Sometimes it begins there. Earth did not throw a parade. It held a vigil, on screens from Lagos to Lahore to Los Angeles. Names scrolled for an hour that felt like a century. Children asked if the aliens would come back. Parents told the truth, possibly. Teachers added the rest, and we will be ready, and we will still try to be kind. At the edge of the system, a single lattice corvette limped toward Hyper. Park let it go, not mercy alone, strategy. They will tell the story, she said to Owino. Make sure the story they tell is accurate. What about us, Admiral? Owino asked. Do we go to them? Carefully, Park said. We do not seek their capital tomorrow. We seek their conscience over months, years. We'll return their prisoners healthy and the captured ships intact enough for them to learn. We'll publish our doctrine. We'll make it embarrassing to lie about us. And if they come again with more? We study again, Park replied. We add a chapter. We keep the same thesis. From the Uit to the equator, Earth exhaled. The forge that had glowed in secret now cooled by degrees, but not to cold, to readiness. Hearthfire had done its work. It remained to build what victory never guarantees but often makes possible if tended, a piece sturdy enough to hold weight. On the capital world of the Lattice, the high convergence chamber had been carved into the living glass of a mountain whose roots touched the mantle. Under normal light, the chamber refracted every speaker's image into hundreds of shimmering duplicates, a reminder that in the Lattice every word had consequences multiplied across the empire. Today, the light felt dimmer, and the reflections less certain. Prefect Halov Saret stood at the center, having surrendered his ship but not his composure. The crown ship axial doctrine was still being towed toward repair yards. Halov had been called back early to account for tactical irregularities, a phrase chosen to avoid admitting what had really happened, defeat. Explain, said Archstrategos Vether, his voice carrying the cold echo of someone who had never lost. You met a one-world species with less than 100 years of spaceflight. You had a fleet, you had ritual, and yet you returned with nothing. Halov chose his words like a surgeon choosing which tissue to cut. They were not what we believed. They have studied us for decades, longer perhaps. They anticipated our formations, our weapons, our political reflexes. That is impossible, Vether scoffed. No primitive. Archstrategos, Halov interrupted softly. I stood on a bridge surrounded by my own fleet's icons turning to ash. It is not only possible, it is done. In one of the upper tiers, Scholar Legate Avarice of the Historical Institute adjusted her silver bands. Our annals record empires falling not to stronger enemies, but to better students. Have we forgotten that? Murmurs fluttered through the chamber like startled birds. The Lattice had always seen itself as the teacher. The idea of being a pupil to a younger species was heresy. Praetor Verun, still bruised from the surrender, rose. They fought differently, as if war were not their first language, but a second they had learned to write poetry in. They boarded our ships and healed our wounded. They fought without hate, which made them harder to hate in return. The words were dangerous. The convergence thrived on clear categories: friend, vassal, threat. A species that blurred lines was a species that could not be contained by standard doctrine. Vether slammed his staff against the floor. We will double the fleet at their border. We will strip their system of defenses. We will. No, Halov said, louder now. You will give them exactly what they have prepared for. They will win again, and every victory will make them more credible. The chamber's glass facets rippled faintly, a sign that the chorus of listening governors was shifting mood. Chancellor Tuver, the political center of the Lattice, leaned forward. Then you propose what? Dialogue, Halov said. Gasps broke out. Not surrender, not alliance. Dialogue on terms we can shape while we still have leverage. And if they refuse? Tuver asked. They will not, Halov said, thinking of Admiral Park's tone. They want the Lattice to see them, to understand them. That is more dangerous than conquest because it means they have a vision for the galaxy, one that does not leave room for our old habits. The chamber fell into a brittle silence. The Lattice had been built on habit, expansion as destiny, intimidation as tool, assimilation as kindness. Halov's words sounded like cracks in the glass. Avarice spoke again, her voice carrying the subtle weight of someone used to being ignored until history proved her right. If what the prefect says is true, we face a decision: double down on a doctrine that failed or adapt before we are forced to. In the glass around them, Halov saw his reflection multiplied 100-fold, but for the first time, some of those faces were not identical. Doubt had entered the hall. In the Commonwealth chamber, victory reports had been filed, ceremonies postponed, and casualty letters already written. Admiral Park sat with President Patel and the Joint Ethics Council, the war maps gone for the moment, replaced by a single long table. Dr. Kaido Mura, historian and council member, spoke first. "We have done what most of our ancestors would have called impossible. But history warns that the moment after triumph is when empires or republics overreach." General Ordega, head of the Strategic Advance Division, leaned forward. "Respectfully, history also warns that if you stop on the high ground, you may be pushed off it. The lattice will come again. The question is, do we wait here or do we carry the fight to where they plan?" Patel glanced at Park. "Admiral," Park's reply was measured. "We prepared to defend home. We did not prepare to govern others. There's a difference between holding a line and drawing a new map." "But deterrence," Ordega began, "isn't just about force," Park cut in gently. "It's about credibility. If we go charging into their territory, we risk becoming exactly what we fought against." Kaido tapped the table. "The Romans called it the cunctator's virtue, knowing when to delay to keep the enemy uncertain without feeding their narrative. Fabius Maximus saved Rome by refusing to meet Hannibal on Hannibal's terms. Ordega smiled faintly, and Scipio won by taking the war to Africa." The room chuckled, but the point was sharp. History offers examples for every choice. The burden is choosing the right one for the moment. From the corner, ethics officer Lena Cho spoke up. "We built Hearthfire on 3 principles: defend the home, minimize harm, and prepare for peace. Extending into lattice space could satisfy the first 2, but the third." The word peace sat in the air like an unspent cartridge. Park thought of the young Marine in the recovery ward, of his admission that victory felt too heavy. "If we move outward, every crew must know why. Not as a slogan, but as a moral geometry they can live with after the firing stops." Patel nodded slowly. "Then let's agree on a course. We will establish a forward shield, patrols, intelligence, and diplomacy at the boundary. We will not seek new territory. But if lattice forces gather for another incursion, we meet them before they cross our sky." A quiet consensus formed. It was neither full advance nor strict retreat. It was something older, the posture of shepherds with long staffs standing at the edge of the pasture. Later in her office, Park read the latest Minerva Digest. Intercepted lattice communications suggested debate, fractures in their council, arguments over whether to escalate or negotiate. It was the kind of noise a good strategist could work with. She keyed a secure channel. "Oh, we know. Begin drafting protocols for dangerous diplomacy. If we talk to them, I want our people as prepared for conversation as they are for combat." "Understood, Admiral," Owino said. "But who talks first?" Park allowed herself a thin smile. "Sometimes the one who speaks first loses. We'll let them think it's their idea." The lattice did not own a word for truce that wasn't condescending. Their closest term translated roughly to conditional pause for instruction. When Chancellor Tuver's council voted, narrowly, to send an envoy to Earth, linguists argued for days about which glyph should adorn the proposal. The chosen emissary was Scholar Legate Avarice, whose voice had once been ignored in the glass hall. Her mandate was twofold: open talks to stall further human military preparation and learn as much as possible about Earth's true capabilities. Halov briefed her privately before departure. "If you go expecting primitives, you will fail before you land. Speak less than you hear. Count what they do not say." "And you?" Avarice asked. "I will argue here for patience," Halov said. "If you give them an opening to humiliate us, Vether will use it to close every door." Avarice's transport was stripped of heavy weapons, its hull painted in the pale blue that in lattice tradition meant petition. In human eyes, it looked like an ice shard drifting toward the inner planets. It entered the solar system under watch from a dozen hidden Aegis arrays. Every vector was tracked, every transmission sifted. Admiral Park met Avarice not in Geneva, but aboard the hospital ship Florence Nightingale, still in geosynchronous orbit with wounded from both sides aboard. The choice was deliberate, to put the envoy in a place where war's cost was visible without needing to be lectured. Avarice stepped into the reception bay, her crest angled in a neutral posture. "Admiral Park," she said in carefully pronounced English. "I bring words from the Convergence." "Then let's sit where we can also hear the machines keeping your people alive," Park replied. In the ward, human and lattice patients lay in alternating beds, monitors translating vital signs across biology. Avarice's eyes moved from a human nurse adjusting a lattice sailor's Roman 4 to a lattice medic murmuring reassurance to a human marine. "This is not what I expected." "That's the point," Park said. "We fight hard, we care harder." They spoke for hours. Avarice offered formal proposals, limits on ship deployments, mutual notification of fleet movements. Park listened, countered, asked for details the envoy wasn't authorized to give. Both women understood that the visible conversation was only the surface. The real exchange was in the questions asked and the silences kept. At one point, Park leaned forward. "Tell your council this, we will not be absorbed, we will not absorb you, but the next time your fleets cross our border, they will not find us less ready. And if you come under your own white flag, we will meet you under ours." Avarice studied her. "And if we decide that the galaxy cannot hold both of us, then the galaxy will learn whether it prefers to be taught by an empire or by neighbors," Park said. When Avarice returned to her ship, her aides asked what she had learned. She thought of the ward, the quiet care, the restrained steel. "They are not primitives," she said. "They are gardeners with swords, and they decide when to put either down." The glass hall's light was clearer now, as if the mountain itself sensed a moment that would be remembered. Avarice stood before the Convergence, her report projected in glyphs above her head. "They do not fear us," she said without preamble. "They do not seek our territory. They defend with skill equal to our own, perhaps greater in certain forms of war. And they carry a code not of submission but of restraint." Vether sneered. "Restraint is weakness." "Then weakness has beaten us twice," Avarice replied calmly. Murmurs rose in the upper tiers. Halov stepped forward. "I told you they study, they prepare. If we attack again without changing ourselves, we will lose again and worse." Chancellor Tuver addressed the chamber. "So our choice is clear. Adapt our doctrine or double our fleets." Avarice raised a hand. "Not clear, the humans offered something unusual: coexistence without integration, borders that are respected, dialogue under agreed rules. They will not kneel, but they will not march on us unless provoked." "Provocation," Vether said, "is a matter of perspective." "That is why perspective must change," Avarice countered. The debate ran for hours. Inside corridors, governors whispered about the strain of maintaining endless borders. Merchants calculated the cost of war versus the profit of peace. Strategists imagined new doctrines that borrowed quietly from human adaptability. In the end, Tuver called for a vote. The resolution was narrow but decisive: no immediate military escalation. Initiate structured dialogue. Monitor. Learn. Halov caught Avarice's eye as the chamber emptied. "You bought us time. I planted something," she said. "We will see if it grows." On Earth, Park received the encrypted summary with a line from Patel. They blinked first. "Use the time well." She stood on Luna's far side, watching welders begin work on a new generation of ships. Not larger, not deadlier, smarter. Some would carry more medical bays. Some would be designed to disable, not destroy. The forge still glowed, but its heat was being shaped into tools as much as into weapons. In a school in Nairobi, a teacher held up a globe and asked her students to point to Earth. They did. Then she asked them to point to where the lattice lived. None could, and she told them that was fine. "What matters," she said, "is not where they are, it's what we decide to be when they arrive." And in the Uat dark, 2 patrol ships, 1 human, 1 lattice, passed within sensor range. They did not fire. They did not speak. But both captains noted the other's presence in their logs, and both wrote the same word beside the entry: observed. Because sometimes, before peace can be written, it must first be witnessed.